So how do verbs work? That's the question we're going to look at in this video when we're looking at how verbs work under verbal aspect rather than under the old system. Hi, I'm Daryl Burning from Master New Testament Greek, here to help you with the tools, habits, and system to master the Greek of the New Testament. If that sounds interesting to you, go ahead, hit subscribe to this channel, and then hit the notify bell to be notified when new videos are released. So under the old way of looking at verbs, we regarded time as part of the tense form itself. So aorist tense tended to refer to verbs that took place or actions that took place in the past. The present tense refers to actions that take place in the present, and the future tense, of course, still looks forward to events that take place in the future. So here's the question. How do we know if an aorist is referring to the past, to the present, or to the future? How do we know if a present tense is referring to the future or the past, or maybe to the present? That's the question we're looking at in this lesson today. And we're looking at this based on verbal aspect. And so if you're not sure about what verbal aspect is, or if you didn't watch last week's video, then go ahead and I'll leave a link to that up here and you can watch that and see what verbal aspect is all about. How do we work out how a verb is working in any given situation? Well, there are three things to look for. The first of these is what's called semantics. And semantics refers to what is encoded in the tense form itself. And we saw from last week's video that what is not encoded in the tense form is time. And so again, check out the link for that to find out more. So what is included in the tense form? What does get portrayed by the fact that this is an aorist? And so there are two things that the tense form portrays to us. The first one is what we call aspect, verbal aspect. And there's two aspects that you need to be aware of. The first one is called the imperfective aspect. And the imperfective aspect simply looks at the event as an event in progress. The second aspect is what's called the perfective aspect. And the perfective aspect looks at the event as a whole. Okay, so the imperfective looks at the event as from the inside as an event in progress, and a perfective aspect looks at the event as a whole from the outside. And in last week's video, we talked about the difference between looking at a parade from a helicopter, seeing it as a whole, versus standing on the street corner watching the parade go by. Okay, that's the difference. Perfective sees it from the helicopter view as a whole. Imperfective sees it as it goes by from the inside. Okay, so those things are conveyed by the tense form itself. And so there's two aspects, perfective and imperfective, and those are conveyed by the tense form itself. Now, there's another thing that is conveyed by the tense form itself, and that is what's sometimes referred to as remoteness, or perhaps better referred to as proximity. And this is a spatial quality. So in other words, when you look at an aorist, or you look at a perfect, or you look at a present tense form, these all have this idea of a spatial quality built into them. In other words, they have this idea of nearness or far or remoteness. Okay, and this is still from the perspective of the author. So the author is conveying an event using this idea of aspect and using this idea of remoteness by choosing the tense form that he's using. And so when we talk about this as a spatial quality, this idea of proximity or remoteness, we don't mean it's referring to distance, okay? It may refer to distance, but more likely it's going to refer to time, or it's going to refer to something conceptually. So the aorist tense form has this idea of remoteness built into it, and therefore it's often used in a time-bound way to indicate past time. However, the aorist tense form doesn't indicate past time in and of itself. It's that idea of nearness or remoteness combined with the context that indicates past time. And I'll talk about that in just a moment a little bit more. The other thing is conceptual distance. And so a verb may have a conceptual remoteness to it. So for instance, when you're reading a narrative text, the narrative tends to flow with the aorist form. And then you get the imperfective aspect with the imperfect tense form that has this idea of background information. And so there's this idea of remoteness built into the imperfect form to put this as background information. So it's a conceptual remoteness, not a temporal remoteness, okay? But when you think about a verb, it has the idea of either remoteness or nearness from a proximity point of view. From the author's perspective, he's picking out the tense form to convey whether the event is in motion or in progress viewed from the inside, and whether it is spatially near in a conceptual sense or a temporal sense. And so he's picking his tense forms based on those kind of ideas. So that needs to be taken into account when you look at how a verb is working. And so then if you think about the different tense forms that there are, and you think about the encoding of those forms, you get the present tense, which has the imperfective aspect with the idea of nearness or proximity. You have the imperfective tense form with the idea of the imperfective aspect, just like the present, but now it's got the idea of remoteness. The aorist tense form has the idea of is a perfective idea, so it's looking at the event as a whole, but then it's also got this idea of remoteness. The future, and well, we'll talk about the future another time, but the future, the perfect, and the pluperfect also have these idea of aspect, and they also have this idea of proximity or remoteness built into them. So all of this is built into the tense form. So to understand how a verb is working, you need to take these things into account from the tense form itself. But the tense form itself is not the only thing you're looking at. The other thing that's going to give you a clue here is what's called the lexeme. And this is going to indicate what the word actually means. So the meaning of the word actually builds into it something of the type of action that is taking place. So for instance, in Luke chapter 8:45, we have the crowds press upon you. Sunekusen here refers to this progressive idea of pressing upon, holding fast to. And this has a progressive lexeme. It's not something that's done quickly. It is something that is viewed in its own right. The lexeme itself has this progressive idea. So another example would be John 10. I am the good shepherd, and I know those who belong to me. I know my own. The gnosko here, this is a stative lexeme. How do we know it's a stative lexeme? Well, because either it doesn't take an object, right? So I know, it actually does take an object in this case, so that doesn't count. But some verbs, they actually don't take an object. And so, for instance, Jesus says, I am, ego eimi, right? The eimi is a stative verb because it doesn't take an object. But in this case, it does take an object. But in this case, with gnosko, the object is not acted upon or affected by the verb. I know my sheep. The sheep are not affected by the fact that Jesus knows them from a grammatical perspective. If the boy hits the ball is affected by the hitting, okay? And so you can see the distinction there. So this is a stative lexeme because it doesn't take an object which is affected by the force of the verb itself. Another example here in Matthew chapter 17 is, for often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And so here you have a lexeme which is actually punctilia. This is an instantaneous event. Built into the meaning of to fall, pimpto, has this idea of this is something that's instantaneous. Therefore it's punctilia. Okay, it's a punctilia or non-stative lexeme. And so the lexeme itself, the word itself, the meaning of the word itself actually is helpful in helping us to understand how a word is working. The other key thing to bear in mind when you're looking at how a word is working, how a verb is working in Greek, is the context. So let's take that example from Matthew 17 we just looked at. Often he falls into the fire, and look at that again. So in this case, we can tell from the context there are a number of clues about how this word is working. First of all, we have the fact that it's a punctilia or a non-stative lexeme. But then you have this idea that the context is providing repetition. How so? Because you have this adverb, polakis here, which is indicating that this is something that happens repeatedly. Often he falls into the fire. And so the context is telling you something about the verb, is modifying the verb to tell you that this is something that happens over and over. And so by conclusion, we can say then that this verb is an iterative verb. And so if you look up a grammar, you look under the present tense form of this verb, you're going to find an iterative present or a repetitive present. That's what this is. Another aspect of this, just to bear in mind from the context, is that the genre itself is telling you something about when this takes place. So even though he's using the present tense verb here, he's using the present tense verb in the genre, which is narrative. The narrative genre inherently looks back to the past. This is an event that has taken place in the past, and Matthew is recounting this event for us. But even though he's recounting a past tense event, he's using the present tense verb form to tell us how this happened, to draw us in, to help us to see the constant difficulty that this father and his son have to live with. And so that's how this verb is working. Now, to help you with this, I've actually provided you with a cheat sheet. So if you want to go to mntg.me/verbsheet, you can download a free cheat sheet which will walk you through this step by step and help you to remember not only the semantic issue, the tense and the form, or even looking at the different tenses and how they all work, not only the lexeme and the context, but also I give you in there a bunch of very common ways that the different tense forms are used within different contexts. And you can then use these three tests, the semantics, the lexeme, and the context, to determine which one of these aktionsarts actually best fits the circumstance or the context you're looking at. So you can go ahead and download that for free. Just go to mntg.me/verbsheet and get that for yourself now. So going through this then, there are three things to think about when you're looking at an indicative tense form. You want to look at the semantics, you want to look at the lexeme itself, you want to look at the context. Those three things are the key and the clue to you understanding how this verb is working in context. So here's a question I want to leave with you. How will you use these three things when you come to study the text of Scripture? Leave a comment below, let me know. I look forward to hearing from you there. So if this has been helpful, go ahead, subscribe to this channel, hit the notify bell to be notified when new videos are released, and keep taking small, consistent steps to mastery, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.